Welcome to another conversational session with Retha van Schyf, a futurist who specializes in radical transformation. My name is Jaco, and today I'm sitting with Retha, the founder of Salience, an agency who specializes in socio-economic development.
That's correct.
How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. It's a nice, crisp morning in Namibia. So yes, how can one not then be well? And excited to be here and be in conversation with you.
So let's start off with, what is a socio-economist?
Let me begin by giving you perhaps more the textbook description, and then I might kind of add my take on it.
Okay.
Technically, what a socio-economist does, it works on the economic and social factors of an environment. So in other words, how do human processes impact economy, or how does economic processes impact humans? Mm-hmm. The way that I kind of describe it is, my aim really is to see, can I in a particular place make the economics work better, and or can I make the social stuff about people better, and ideally through that create a more sustainable future for that place.
I think Namibia offers a lot of opportunity for that, correct?
It certainly has, yes, unexpectedly so.
Because still, I think we talked about it the other day, still a young nation.
Correct.
Still a lot of room for improvement.
Exactly.
Discovering an identity in that sense.
Yes, which is hugely exciting. I think it's, on a precipice of many of these opportunities in time to come.
You are originally actually from?
South Africa.
South Africa.
I am Southern African, yes, so a close neighbour. And in essence, as you kind of well know, was actually really part of South Africa. So, we're not too different in our original cultures.
How does it look in practice?
What that really means in practice is that we actually work with either individuals or individual leaders more typically, and or with companies or with public sector owners like a regional government or a local government, and begin to work with them as, how do we create a very different future for a place or a company? So we actually applied in the context to either create commercial transformation, economic transformation, or social transformation in a defined environment.
Okay, so it's both, it's not just both, it's governmental, it's private sector, and you bring them together.
Correct, and I love that you've picked up on that point. What it really is, if I was to kind of answer in a different way, is that you work with the public sector, you work with the private sector, but the one that I perhaps didn't so clearly mention in the previous part is civil society.
Yes.
So there's actually these three core stakeholders that you kind of work to get to either better economic states or better social states, and hopefully both. That's the magic moment.
It's a few stakeholders, and of course, I'm pretty sure we're going to get to this a bit later, but the public is also involved.
Yes,
the general public, the population.
That's what I mean by that bucket of civil society.
Yes.
So civil society can represent NGOs or public benefit organizations, but it can also represent the community and the public, depending on whether you talk about a town or a city. But yes, they're critical stakeholders in the process of placemaking or town transformations.
I'm happy to hear that, because I find sometimes with high-level decision-making that not all the stakeholders are usually brought into the mix.
I think that's also kind of, if one wants to look at it from a social development perspective, there was an era in which hierarchical decision-making was commonplace. That's what we understood as leadership. But I think now we're evolving to a place where we understand, the actual decision-making of the diverse constituency needs to be considered. So yes, it is your public sector, but also that you need the participation of your environment that will actually live or operate in that environment.
That's very
consulted. True. So I think it's an evolution of maturity of leadership that is developing,
and it's very progressive, actually, to take something that is kind of almost to a degree, like you said, set in stone for a long time, and now it comes into where way more people are involved.
Correct.
It's probably not always the easiest thing.
You touched on a vital component, because I kind of consider that to be the process of decision making, and it's complex because on the one hand, you want decisions that are incorporating the feedback from your community. But on the other hand, if it's full democracy in that space, it will be difficult to please all. So somewhere you need to find that balance where there is a group of leaders that's been elected through various processes, whether it's the leaders of a company, whether it's the leaders of a regional government or a local government. They have to be given the power to make decisions on behalf of the rest, but it has to be in some form consulted with that constituent to whom it applies. So there's a balance to be reached, I think.
Yeah, because people in government positions are there. They are public servants.
Correct.
So they, of course, need to listen to people, but they were voted into a position where they need to make these decisions.
Correct. Or empowered to, for sure.
What is transformation? How is it different from change management?
It is definitely a question that has led to a lot of debate because some people think, isn't it one and the same thing? Mm-hmm. But from my perspective, the way that change is described is kind of where you've got an existing process or existing product where you want to make it slightly better or more efficient. Mm-hmm. So it's in essence the same process that you're just trying to tweak to make it better. Where in the case of transformation, you're either really looking at the underlying substance or presentation or appearance or composition to radically alter it to get to a very different and ideally improved state. So there's a radicalness that really fundamentally changes it. Perhaps not always to change the fundamental essence, but a core part of it needs to shift, ideally to achieve a better future. And that's often referred to as transformations. If you allow me just to use one or two examples just to illustrate or give color to what I've discussed there. If we perhaps go back to people that still kind of remember the old style of photography where you had that film that you rolled and then it transformed the industry to actually use digital processes. Now, that's a radical transformation in an industry. Mm-hmm. And perhaps if I can take a slightly more modern example is where you look at energy. We've kind of been reliant on fossil fuels for so long. Now we're moving the industry to renewable sources that leads to real different innovations and provision and use and engagement with that product. So those are perhaps in a product term that I would describe represents the radicalness of how it's transforming something fundamentally at its core.
I appreciate those examples. I worked at University of Science and Technology. When I started there, digital photography was already a long time coming, but they still had a dark room. So yes, it was exactly. They taught it specifically in a way to show like how things have transformed. And now again, analog is now a retro thing being reintroduced. So it's very interesting to see how that actually
Of course, yes. Along. No, things do cycle back too. So there is that point.
What exactly then is town transformation?
Town transformation is, in essence, or at least how I language it, is first, perhaps I should just qualify, Jaco, that when I use the word town, I just use it to actually represent all the formations of communities. It's towns, but it can also be a city, like you've just implied, but also can be a region and ultimately also at a country level. But
much bigger,
yes. Much bigger. So, but let's use the kind of notion of towns just for ease of our conversation. But town transformations are, the way we describe it, it's a deliberate program. Mm-hmm. So it's where a situation exists that organically this change won't happen. So you have to create a deliberate program. And the other characteristic of it, that it's typically complex because it involves a huge number of stakeholders in that process, as we perhaps discussed a little bit earlier. But the fundamental purpose of that deliberate and or complex program is to create a new future for a place. So if I perhaps can give you a little bit of color, well, what do I really mean by that is, so let's say, for example, where you have this notion of a mining town and the town was created for purposes of mining. Mm-hmm. And now that mine perhaps has exhausted its resource that it was mining. How do you now create a different economic future for that place, what that was so reliant on that particular central industry?
Because people are already established there, Correct. Living there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's got a sense of identity that's tied to that particular leading industry. So how do you now change its identity, change its future? But that will have to be a deliberate program. That's not very seldom will that organically happen. So you have to intervene to create a special program that changes the trajectory of that environment to allow for a new future.
It's a lot of moving parts with something like that, I would imagine, because it's like you said, it's established, it's got its own identity, and now you're responsible because and I think that's also why the futurist element. This is not short term. This is
it's definitely not
very, very long term.
Absolutely not.
Lots of planning that needs to go into that and sowing the correct seeds to ensure that this happens.
Absolutely. And that's not always natural to some of the people that are involved in the town. So how to actually open their thinking to just how far ahead you need to think. And of course, a lot of it might be a bit of a gamble, but you have to kind of make informed choices of what you believe and or want that future to be. So yes, I fully agree with you.
People are people. They get set in their ways.
Absolutely. And more than you think. More than I thought, that's for sure. That's for sure.
You used the term radical transformation in towns.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on that a bit?
It's certainly a word that I've adopted or created for the purpose of the areas in which I like to operate in this concept of town or city or regional transformations. And what I'm looking to emphasize there is where the need to transform this place, this sense of place or this ecosystem is time critical. So if certain fundamentals are not shifted within a particular time frame, you might not achieve that end state of creating or securing a future for that place. So if you allow me, I might kind of just use that mining example before is, let's say the environment has left it a bit too late to foresee that the mine might actually be close to closure. Mm-hmm. How do you in time now diversify that economy to create an alternative future that will allow that town to exist? So that will be an example where it's time critical, or perhaps another example I could use is, let's, for example, a new industry has found reason to establish itself around a place. How do you, within a particular time frame, expand that environment to allow the workforce of that new industry to have a hosting environment that can allow its workforce to have a normal living environment around its place of work? But normally it's typically time critical. I can also think of your disasters where there's environmental impact that happened, and now you're in a very critical time period, need to secure that environment either for health reasons but also for social reasons, to restitute that place to make sure that it's again a conducive environment for people to live in. So it's the time criticality that makes it radical.
And that creates a few interesting scenarios, because on the one hand, for instance, like you mentioned, a mining town, you can, to a certain degree, determine when that mine might run dry. So any opportunities can actually be planned in advance before it comes to an end. But I mean, that's probably also, it's not just one, it's a lot of people that need to be in the know about that, correct?
I love how you think. And yes, we'd like to think a little bit forward that should be the case. But unfortunately, in practice, it doesn't happen that people foresee that decline early enough and therefore leave it a bit too late. Yes. And that's when this requirement needs to be to actually artificially intersect to now, under critical time pressure, redirect that, because that forward planning was either it wasn't seen, or attention wasn't given to it, wasn't taken seriously enough. And it was something that you, as they say, kick the can down the road. Yes. And then you get to the point where it's too late and then it becomes critical.
And now I'm thinking, I think it's the first time I have the opportunity to talk to someone like you who's in this, I would say, very niche, very specific field. Is it relatively new?
I would say no. I mean, I think it's just new because we've got more global information that kind of reveals to us these different cases. But if you really go and look back, of course, how do communities develop? It is around this sense or idea of placemaking. So it's not a new concept. I think it's just more organically happened in the past. Now it's becoming a field of specialization where there's actual disciplines and skills, a formality of it, really.
Almost consolidation around what it is to actually build something.
Exactly that. So yes, it's therefore new-ish and more formalized at the moment.
And I can only imagine what role it plays to have someone like you or a group of people like you mentioned an example of a disaster or disaster zone, war zone, to actually have specific things in place in mind and examples of how to actually almost reestablish something after something terrible has happened.
Absolutely. And I think why in those cases that you mentioned experts are also deeply welcomed is quite often when that shock happens, everybody's almost paralyzed from that shock and don't know where to start. Yes. So a lot of chaos ensues, a lot of misdirection happens. So if there's somebody that can at least see what are the principal key notes that needs to be ticked off, especially early on, just to kind of contain the potential chaos or the potential risk, and then give it a sense of direction until people can organically take over their positions to redirect that outcome. Very much so.
Wow, it's amazing. What creates the need for town transformation?
I really love that question because I think quite often people think of one or two reasons, but I want to elaborate on at least four that I think, and I'm sure there might be more reasons, but there can be four that normally leads to what I call the impetus to set off the town transformation. One is that environmental disaster that we referred to. And again, the picture that I want to bring into people's minds is the case of Hurricane Katrina, where New Orleans was indirectly impacted as a consequence of the hurricane. And of course, it led to a lot of socioeconomic impacts that then very quickly had to be remediated, or Fukushima from the tsunami. So those are very critical reasons to transform a town. The ones that might be a little bit less obvious are the ones that I will call that there's a socioeconomic reason. One would be Detroit. That might be perhaps a very familiar case in the minds of people. So there, an economic decline led to huge social unrest, unfortunately around racial lines. But that derelict state led to what we call almost a feral town or feral city, where there's such lawlessness that creates such a geopolitical and economic and social risk that you have to actually intervene to redirect that future. Stockton is another town in America that we can look to. But then the third reason, and that's the area where I typically get often involved, is where there's economic impetus. So either there's an economic threat, so perhaps in the cases where we kind of call, let's say, the mine closure will lead to there no longer being economic means for which people to create a livelihood, or there could be an economic growth potential. So as we mentioned before also, a new industry wants to establish itself, and how do you then very quickly grow that economy to allow for that commercial and then economic success? The fourth one that I want to mention that's perhaps not so obviously top of mind perhaps for people are geopolitical reasons in which to transform cities or places. And the best two, or possibly a third example I can give is Singapore.
Yes.
So when Singapore separated itself from Malaysia, it had to reestablish identity to give it a geopolitical positioning in the world, and it did it extremely successfully. Dubai might be another example of that. And then a very obvious example that might immediately allow people to think of other examples too is the Ukraine. So at the moment in a huge geopolitical crisis, and which is causing a lot of devastation on economic fronts, social fronts, environmental fronts. So hopefully if this war ends soon, how does one go about to then transform on a country level to actually bring about a country that can again function what we call organically and sustainably? So those are the 4 reasons. There might be more.
Those are very good examples. It's I'd like to just touch base on 2 of these. It's very interesting, even in, I'd say, super developed countries like the United States, that something like that is still a possibility and that could happen, like the social unrest, or what did you call them, feral?
Yes, exactly, derelict towns.
And it's just very interesting that those things can happen. So it's important to note that this is also not something you come and you finish it and it's gone. It's something that needs to be in place and people need to take it forward with contingencies, I assume.
Very much so, and I love that insight because you're right. I mean, the world is dynamic.
Yes.
Yeah, so it might be that for the next 20, 30 years, you could set it up for success, but then industries change, cultures change, norms change, and then there's kind of perhaps an opportunity that creates a risk to then redirect. But it's to be vigilant and not kind of assume that everything is just going to stay the same. We live in a dynamic world, and if you forgive me, you might pick up in my brand statement, I use this concept of resilient futures.
Yes.
And I think a lot of people think of resilience as this concept of recovery, quick recovery. I take it a step further. I kind of think in this modern world in which we live, where the pace of change is so dynamic, it's the ability to be agile, the ability to adjust, the ability to evolve, and to be constantly aware of that, because I think we might imprison ourselves if we're too tied to what is. And please don't misunderstand me. I'm not talking about throwing away traditions or throwing away cultures, but the necessity to actually evolve in order to actually remain sustainable in our current world.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's exactly, because it's progress.
Exactly.
And progress is a massive responsibility tied to progress, like you mentioned. Not to lose identity or culture or those things, not all of that, but to, I think what I see with your brand is also the discipline that goes with something like this.
Exactly. There's a consciousness to it.
Yeah.
And I kind of think just for me, inspirationally, the catchphrase that kind of really touched my heart was this notion of best of both. You do focus on the traditions, but you also do focus on necessary progress and allow these to blend. Of course, that's the ideal. One doesn't quite get that sweet spot always right, but that's what one aspires to. And again, the social economic blend, but also old and new. And how do you find those balances?
And it's from what I've gathered from what you've said, it's so many different elements and so many moving parts.
It's definitely textured.
It's infrastructure. It's everything that comes together. You mentioned the Ukraine, and it might be a bit of a loaded question to ask something like this, but the war will eventually end.
Yes, one hopes so. Sooner rather than later.
Yeah, sooner rather than later. And instead of maybe asking, how do you transform something like that, rather ask the question, where do you actually start then?
It's complex, and I think the Ukraine might be a little bit of a complex example to use, but we can definitely kind of work with that one. The first thing that I kind of think and do in these situations where I'm invited to partake in these programs is to begin to first immerse yourself in what is. So it's very important to know what is the legacy of the place, what was its reason to be, what was its economic drivers, what was its cultural drivers, what remains important, what is happening around that. So I call that almost scanning. So you have to really understand your geographical context, your environmental context, your economic context, your social stories. And from that, not only discern from what is, but begin here to kind of use almost this futurist side to kind of say, well, what could be? What might be? Where are the trends of the world moving? What role can the Ukraine play in it? What role does it want to play? And then to begin to shape ideas through which you can form a vision with the stakeholders then. So there you, of course, have to work closely with the stakeholders we mentioned earlier, not just your public sector, more often actually your private sector, because they need to play a role in the economic development, but also then your civil society. You know, what is the identity we can recreate? But in that particular case, which is why I was a little bit hesitant to want to use that example, but it's not untrue for others. In the case of Ukraine, you will also have to do a lot of healing. So how do you actually help people recover from the trauma that they've just experienced in terms of family loss, loss of assets, loss of identity, loss of culture? And how through that process do you do the healing component plus the development component will make Ukraine, perhaps if we look back also like the case of South Africa, a little bit closer to home and not too dissimilar for Namibia, but perhaps a little bit more pronounced, where you also have to have that element because there's been trauma in the environment that you need to consider as part of your transformation process.
It's very interesting what you say when you mention all these elements. You call it scanning. For me, it sounds very much like you have to have a deep sense of empathy to be able to do this, because that's literally putting yourself into the shoes of everyone in that space.
I also really like that question, Jaco. It's very incisive. And although that is so true, I want to also haste and just put some qualification to that. You have to have empathy, but it can't be that you so immerse yourself in empathy that it becomes too socially focused that you lose sight that the actual real recovery kernel sits in focusing on the economic potential. And in that comes a little bit more harder or hard-lined or less emotive decision-making. So I want to say yes, for sure, and put yourself in the shoes of everybody around the table. But that absolutely cannot be done without the economic focus of what are critical decisions that has to be made in order to actually secure that future that will ultimately help people progress.
And that's actually what I wanted to add. It is the sense of empathy, because then you have a genuine understanding. It's also the importance of experience and understanding from different case studies.
Exactly.
As well as being a dreamer, in your case, the futurist aspect.
The futurist aspect, correct. And then that's a little bit tough because not everybody can yet see that future. And our sense of identity is currently psychologically very much tied to the now,
to the current
or to
situation.
The past.
Yeah.
And that's valuable, but how can you take the best of that and pull that into a future that will actually allow them to secure a new future that can inherit some of those components that remain of value?
I think that is actually an incredibly important message, especially to people in such unfortunate circumstances, because I think you're right, in that moment all seems lost.
Absolutely. And people are afraid.
Yeah. And
even the decision makers are afraid, although they can't admit that.
Yeah.
But there is a part of them that are uncertain, because it is very difficult to know, well, what's the right thing to do? Where do I even start? I mean, this is such a big problem. How do I unravel the spaghetti ball to just get a sense of momentum and certainty? And people are quite often afraid to make decisions in that phase, which then kind of means you stall the opportunity and it actually gets worse.
Yes.
Unfortunately. So some decisions are better than no decisions or perfect decisions. It's kind of my motto there.
Oh, but that's good. I hope the right people actually hear this, see this, and get the message, because there needs to be a sense of hope.
Correct. Exactly.
Going into even during a terrible, devastating situation.
Absolutely. And I kind of think therefore people like I that are perhaps, geared to kind of, navigate through that process can then stand alongside them. So I want to be very clear. We don't make decisions on behalf.
Yes.
We give options and we give guidance. And because with a lot of understanding of how complex some of those decisions can be, but to hopefully bring some certainty that can then bring the confidence back to actually make that decisions perpetually themselves over time. So it's instilling that confidence back into the system.
And then getting kind of like the snowball effect.
That's exactly
that. It happens organically after.
Exactly. You want to get to that tipping point and then kind of allow the process to take over organically and sustainably.
That is incredibly interesting and incredibly important. What triggered your interest in this field?
I think in my case, there's a part of me that is just in the way that my brain has developed or exists is I love to see efficiency. So it just naturally goes there. And I think through my professional background was also the skill set that developed to actually find an ease to make decisions in complexity and see almost a path through to complexity. So I think that's the part that drew me professionally. But if I speak for a moment more from the heart, I mean, I think, what an awesome potential and experience it is to create potential futures for new people.
It's actually very interesting because it also says something about the person, the character, because you cannot actually go into this with almost a sense of selfishness, because I think it's a great thing when people want to be in control of something, and this is something we really have to go, because it's, in the end, not really about you. It's about more.
None of it is about you. I think you're literally acting as a facilitator and a pace setter. It is about listening well to others so that you can actually be the person that can corral the needs of others, because it's their sense of place. But I think it, of course, does help to have some affinity towards it so that you appreciate the sensitivities in it and can have on the very subtle edges, you have a sense of what is important for the people there and keep that alive. But yes, the last thing it is about you. And that's hopefully also where we differentiate a bit, is to actually kind of truly make it about the others. And the others is the economic future, but also the people.
Yeah.
And to find a balance, as we said before now, between those two.
I like that a lot. And I think the name salience is very much, it almost sounds like sentience or sentient for me, because I think that's what it is to be a bit of a higher level of consciousness, because it's very important to actually think broader.
Yes. And on a very practical level, it was certainly that we wanted to convey. But the other thing is also just practically, we are known in the market to actually find movement, to actually find forward momentum in these moments of complexity, or almost moments of chaos, I would like to say. And it's like finding the how-to, finding what is important through these critical phases that, of course, we wanted to kind of make sure we distinguish on and really represents what we believe in.
And I fortunately had the good opportunity to sit with you before this, where you told me that you have an extremely busy mind. And I do think that kind of plays a role in that, because the busy mind connects the dots even when you're asleep. And I think
it's absolutely right. Yes, I mean, thank you for understanding that. You explain my brain better than most, but it is, and I think that could be sometimes a disadvantage if you want to sleep at night.
Yes.
But for the advantages of it, yes, you're absolutely right. It allows you then to kind of see which of the balls needs to connect at what moment. But one's mind never stops to try and find, well, what's the next step? What's the next step?
You already mentioned to us that you're from South Africa, Cape Town. But
yes,
growing up,
born and bred.
Who did you want to be? What did you want to be?
It's actually interesting, but it also shows you how one's influenced by TV at the time, because I think in my earlier phases, I really wanted to contribute to the world through the space of law. So I actually studied law to begin with and wanted to kind of imitate the concept of Ally McBeal, fight for justice, make the world right through law. But my career then took a strong turn to actually kind of go into investment banking and then ultimately complex change. But I think I didn't quite have that unique calling. I think some people are lucky enough to kind of know very early on they want to be a doctor or they want to be an accountant. For me, I think the process was a little bit more organic. But one thing that I was very clear on for a very young age is that I wanted to be an adventurer. I wanted to experience. I want to immerse myself in different cultures. I want to understand. I want to have that sense of wonder across the world. And I think in some way that's come a little bit true, because then you kind of get to know different places and what makes that place be. And I think the adventure lust has been satisfied through that experience.
And that eventually, I think you mentioned to me before we started, that kind of patience you didn't know you had to have to get to where you are now played a huge role in what you're doing now.
Yes, and I think the universe is having a bit of a joke on me with that one, because I am a very impatient person by nature. So I want to see that change now. I want to see that change tomorrow. And here I found myself in places where you actually have to have tremendous patience. So I definitely think I need to learn patience as being part of my life journey. But yes, I eventually got there.
Well, that's fantastic. And I think your worldly experience, because you said adventure, you have traveled a lot, that also helps with your bigger decision making. or seeing the bigger picture.
Absolutely, because I think one's got a lot more diversity to draw from, and I think a lot of appreciation for differences, but also you've got a global view of what can be. So you can also perhaps mix to places that's perhaps not otherwise exposed to how another place does something, and then try to find these blends that you can then bring some advantages to a particular project because of these broader views that you have. But again, very important that you don't come and impose that and think that you've learned from other places and then come and suggest it on a place where those perhaps what fitted there is not well equipped or suited to this environment. And that's a very important point. Because a lot of people look at the world, especially if you're a development country, you think that the West, for example, knows and they've done it right and therefore want to step in the shoes to imitate their examples and perhaps do it at the cost of a lot more potential that you have locally. So I very quickly warn against, yes, bring your broader context, but don't come with the assumption to impose elsewhere, because there's always uniquenesses in a sense of place that shouldn't be lost, because that's what makes the place unique.
Yes.
And it differentiates.
I think, like you said, it's like what works in one place doesn't necessarily work.
Absolutely not, and don't assume that.
Because in this space, it could have taken 200 years to get to that point.
Correct.
You have to take all that into consideration.
Correct. Yeah, and it's a different place with different factors that influence that, with different cultural backgrounds, different mindsets, different social conditioning that might not fit in a very different location. So one has to be very mindful for that.
No, I think it's interesting because I think there are enough examples in this world to see that, for instance, a community that might have been disadvantaged at one point, given a set of tools, something new to work with without the proper education, and that whole system kind of falls flat. I've seen that a few times.
Absolutely, yeah, for sure. And I think Namibia might be, maybe, I mean, you tell me if you think differently as a Namibian, but you might be at that cross-sect now. I mean, as you kind of said, you're a new country that's kind of now finding its real independent feet post-independence. And here, now where you perhaps have had a desert environment that you could argue there's not a lot of value to be derived from that, other than mining. But now with the decarbonization movement, all of a sudden, through a happy coincidence of nature almost, and time, you've got the potential to make a huge contribution to the green industry movement. And again, now, will you be ready to embrace that and then give yourself a whole different trajectory to what you perhaps had 5 years ago?
And that's a fantastic example.
So, yeah, so it speaks to your point.
It's lots of opportunities coming, and I think both private sector and the government doing a lot in the sense to properly, systematically educate people and implement. So it's not just here it is, make it work.
Absolutely. No, I think there's you can see that progression in the government, and therefore applaud your government a lot for these industrialization programs that they've launched. Yeah, it's ambitious.
It is, yeah.
But I think that's where you have to start. I think now, as we might discuss later, my only caution there would be is, can one back it up with implementation components? If you don't mind, I want to actually perhaps draw a bit of an anecdote here. I'm going to draw on a personality assessment framework that's called Insights. It's drawn from a concept called Insights. Okay. And the early incarnation of this framework identified 4 broad categories. And as a personality, you're either yellow, and your yellow represents people that are visionaries. They're the creatives. They understand potential. They come up with ideas. So that's normally their strength. But if they think of too many ideas, they never quite implement it. So then chaos might come from, what about this? What about this? What about this? Then you have the red person. The red person is very much your personality types that are driven towards execution. So yes, I care about new ideas. I love a new idea. But once we've got an idea, let's make it happen. Let's make decisions. Let's get to the end state. So that's the advantage. Their disadvantage is that they might be a little bit dictatorial, or they might do it decision-making without bringing people with them. They could be a bit impatient. Then you have your third category that are your green people, and they care more about the people. What about the people? It's your doctors, it's your teachers. So let's save people out of poverty. How does the team feel? How do we feel? And then you have the blue category, and your blue category are really your very linear thinkers. So it's your engineers, and I'll come back to that in a moment. It's your accountants. So it's people that are familiar with process, and they follow processes for good reason, because they build the bridges of the world. They've really literally built our world. Now, if I use that framework and use it a little bit in the context of town transformation, I use that framework to assess the place in the beginning. So what is the composition of these? Now, for a moment, to your point now, look at Namibia. I think because of its industry history, Whereas maybe got mining as a critical component. There's a lot of engineers in this particular environment. So there's a lot of linear process making, but not a lot of reds. So you've got a lot of yellows, or some yellows that come up with really good ideas. And you definitely do give your people that care about the society, that wants to actually help uplift people. But you've got a lot of blue. It's almost like a blue haze, but we need to get more red into Namibia. So how do we get to execution on these ambitious programs that your yellows have created, but let's not get too blue on?
Yes, no, of course.
That I think would for me be a very big, perhaps just a symbolic description of what I would say to Namibia is, you've clearly got good thinkers. There's no doubt about that. You've got the people that can technically do it, but can you get to your point that you drive implementation in an organized way?
I think with us in particular, there is, and I'm speaking on correction, but this is just my experience in a few industries. There's a skill shortage. And I think in order to execute this professionally and correctly, with skill transfer in mind, you need to bring in.
I agree with you. I agree with you. You need to bring in people. I think you have brought in people in the past. Perhaps in the past it had a lot of people that come with donor funding mindset, as opposed to with actually coming with a skill set that you want to truly instill, so you don't create a further dependency. And you don't have people that, kind of want to come and help, and they truly intend to help, but they don't really have skin in the game because they don't have to live with the legacy.
Yes, of course.
And therefore, I kind of think you're right. It's certainly kind of an aspiration that I have, is to truly instill skills like mine. And of course, it will require a lot of skill sets, alongside skills like mine, to actually bring to fruition these very ambitious industrial programs. But again, want to commend your government for identifying these and mobilizing the country with very clear deliberation around it. Now it's just driving implementation to those promises and well thought out plans.
No, I do also appreciate where the government is planning to take us and identifying certain things. There are social issues, of course. I think every country has its issues. But as mentioned, we are young. There's possibility for change.
Correct.
I think someone like you, also the ability to transfer this knowledge and skill, and this is why I actually like this kind of thing, because even this has so much value.
Sure.
Because people can listen to this and it's like, but that is a very interesting, very interesting field.
I also have a deep empathy. People that are in places of leadership, a lot of trust has to be established. Why would they trust somebody like me? And rely on my advice. So I think that component is also critically necessary, so that trust can be established, so that the skill set can be transferred. Because otherwise, if that trust is not there, they cherry pick some of the skills, but it might not be all of the nuances, and it might be from their biases what they think is important, but they're missing some of the really important ingredients, and then the cake doesn't fully rise or flop a little bit in the end. So it is to have true trust, that there's an authentic partner that really sincerely means to actually provide the skill set into them to allow them to help themselves. It's not something that comes to tell you what to do. I might have recommendations, but I want to inform you why some might work for you, but you ultimately need to decide.
But the whole idea of actually kind of eradicating dependency.
And absolutely, that for me is, my intent is to instill resilience, so you could be agile, so give the tools so that you can actually use them to kind of develop your own ways in which to actually then be agile going forward and do more with yourself.
I think that boils down to the name, right?
Yes.
Retha, thank you so much. I think this has been, for me, this has been extremely insightful. I think it's absolutely fascinating, and it's obviously a very important role that you're playing currently and going forward. And I look forward to the rest of the things we will talk about in the future episodes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jaco. Thank you for your time.